Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Perry Worldhouse. It's really a great pleasure to see all of you and really glad that you can be with us to have this really important event to discuss the election of last week. My name is Michael Weisberg, the Deputy Director of Perry Worldhouse, and I'm joined by my two colleagues on the leadership team, people who I think need no introduction, yet I will introduce them anyway to you. So on all the way to my right is Professor Michael Horowitz, who's the Director of Perry Worldhouse and the Richard Perry Professor of Political Science at Penn. He's the author of Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics, and the co-author of Why Leaders Fight. His research interests include the intersection of emerging technology, such as artificial intelligence and robotics, with global politics, military innovation, the role of leaders in international politics, and geopolitical forecasting methodology. I think many of you know that Professor Horowitz had previously worked in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Department of Defense and just returned from a second time in the Department of Defense. So welcome back, Mike. Great to share the stage with you again today. To my immediate right is Marie Harf, the Executive Director of Perry Worldhouse. Marie comes to Penn, or came to Penn last year with 2 decades of varied experience in the federal government, higher education, media, and politics. She worked as senior advisor and strategic communications advisor to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and the deputy spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State. She was also the foreign policy director on Barack Obama's 2012 reelection campaign. Marie, since 2017, has been an on-the-air commentator on Fox News, where she spent a lot of last week, and we're really delighted to have both of you here to start this really important conversation. We're going to have extra time for questions from the audience here because the three of us are familiar faces to you, but I'm going to ask a couple of questions to kick us off. So Mike, Marie, the first question I'd like to ask both of you is just a really broad one. So as we think about this new administration that will begin in January, what are some of the kind of biggest foreign policy directions we'd expect? How will the country change its direction under President-elect Trump? What do you think his top foreign policy priorities might be? So Mike, why don't you start?
Sure. It's great to be back, and I hope Marie's had a nap after last week. But that's good. I mean, it's like, so say we all. I think a second Trump presidency, frankly, we can look at the first Trump presidency for evidence, broadly of what we're likely to see, along with what President-elect Trump said in the campaign. And the two issues that have animated President-elect Trump since, frankly, the early 1980s, maybe even like late 1970s, are immigration and trade policy. And now both of those are mixes of domestic policy and foreign policy more than they are, straight ahead, diplomacy with X country, or, what is the U.S. military doing about Y problem? And like, we can talk about all that stuff. And I think Marie and I are happy to. But, to me, we're likely to see at least if there is follow through on what we saw in the campaign, we're likely to see a increase in tariffs. The only question is how much and how many countries does it cover? Is it, just focused on the PRC? Is it focused on everybody with some opt-outs for countries? Like, how big is it? But, tariffs, number one. Number two is a crackdown on immigration, with the extent of it a little bit TBD. But the announcement that Tom Homan will be the border czar, given his role in the first Trump administration, suggests that President-elect Trump is serious about following through on the statements he made in the campaign about cracking down on immigration being a top priority. I guess we could both go on actually about all of this stuff for a whole hour. So let me stop there.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming today. I think I am glad we took a week to do this because now we have some personnel decisions made by the Trump administration. I think we're seeing some initial policy decisions. So I think we'll get into some of that today. But as Michael said, I was in the Obama administration when we did the last Trump transition. I was working for Secretary Kerry. I left, noon on January 20th with my boxes and went home. And so I have a lot of empathy for the people in the Biden administration right now who are dealing, as we know, we have one president at a time. They're at COP, the climate conference this week. They're still dealing with Middle East negotiations with the specter of a very different administration upcoming. So I think, keeping that in mind is important. I also think that we can look to some of what Donald Trump said on the campaign trail for clues about what he might do as president. So the Trump campaign's big line during this last election cycle was, when Trump was president, there were no new wars. Russia didn't invade Ukraine. Hamas didn't attack Israel. The world was, quote, calm. Now, we can talk about all the reasons for that, and we can talk about whether or not you agree with that premise. But I heard from a lot of voters I talked to that notion, right, the Afghanistan withdrawal, that was the day that Joe Biden's approval rating dropped below 50%, and it never recovered. People who tell you foreign policy doesn't matter, that was the day. That literally that event. So Trump has talked, he said in 24 hours I could solve the Russia-Ukraine war. I don't think that is realistic, but I do think in that conflict, he will push Ukraine to cede territory to Russia and to negotiate, in part by cutting off aid to Ukraine. The Biden administration right now is trying to rush some of the military armament that's already been approved. Donald Trump Jr. tweeted yesterday a meme with Zelensky saying, your allowance is about to get cut off. So I think Russia, Ukraine is one place where Trump will focus. In the Middle East, he's quite close to Bibi Netanyahu, despite some recent or some past skirmishes. If you look at how Bibi congratulated him, I think it tells you something. He is going to push, I think, do another push at Saudi-Israel normalization, building on the Abraham Accords, which I have many thoughts about and we can talk about. But I think he will allow Israel to, even more than the Biden administration, to continue to go after Hamas and Hezbollah. But I think he wants that conflict, in whatever form that looks like, to be quote, finished. But I think he will focus on that in a very different way than the Biden administration. And then the last thing I would say is he's quite a transactional person, Donald Trump. And I think in general, economics trumps geopolitics. So Mike very rightly brought up trade. But when trade or economic issues comes up against geopolitical issues, in my view, I think economics usually wins with Trump. This is something we'll have to look at. And I think we all will have to prepare for a real premium on chaos. He, I think, prides himself on being a predictable madman, and that, his team talks about him that way, that he is chaotic. He brings chaos to an international system that often feels like, every country just behaves in a way that is quite predictable. So his chaos is in fact something people have learned to work around. And if you look at all of the statements that world leaders have made since he was elected, they've learned in the last 8 years how to get on his good side, what language to use, and how to work with him in some way. So those are some sort of framing comments for how I'm looking at the next 4 years, given what we know that he did before, but also he will not be able to run again. He will surround himself with very different people, I think, that have fewer guardrails and respect for institutions. And I think that will make the second term have a little bit different character than the first.
Thanks, Marie. So you both have made oblique reference to personnel, so I wanted to just go there. A few key personnel decisions have been announced. So he's announced that Senator Rubio, Congresswoman Stefanik, Congressman Waltz will be in his administration in key foreign policy roles. I wondered if we could look to those appointments and make any predictions. Maybe Mike, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, look, personnel is policy, in that the president can't be everywhere doing everything. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of employees throughout the federal government doing all sorts of different things, some of which we know about and some of which we don't know about. And those appointments to senior posts like Stefanik to the United Nations, Rubio to be Secretary of State, Waltz to be the National Security Advisor. Now, that tells you maybe something about where things are going. I think it is important, though, to recognize, building on something Marie said, that the reason why a Trump administration and, from the perspective of his people is, calibrated chaos, essentially, is the desire to centralize power in decision-making more in the White House. Not that, look, the president's always really powerful. It's not that, the president's super. I mean, really weak in some ways that you'd be surprised by, but super powerful in like lots of different ways. But a Trump presidency is likely to feature more decision centralization in the White House. And then the question is, what happens when the eye of the White House is not focused on a particular policy issue? What kinds of policies are being implemented? If you look at somebody like Senator Rubio, for example, he's made lots of different statements about foreign policy over the years, some of which are frankly consistent with what one might call a more traditional American international role, working with allies and partners, supporting a strong defense budget, et cetera, some of which have been, for lack of a better term, Trumpier. And, one would imagine that his appointment suggests that it is the like Trumpier Rubio that we will thus be more likely to see, which is entirely appropriate since the president should appoint people that implement the president's, if the extent that the president has an agenda, that is the way that our, like elections have consequences. That's the way that our system is set up. But I think both with Stefanik, with Rubio, with Waltz, what you're seeing are people that already know what President-elect Trump wants and are thus probably going to be in some ways more capable of delivering policy outcomes that they think he wants than arguably some of the leaders were in Trump's first term, where he showed up in some ways perceived as a little bit more of a blank slate from a foreign policy and national security perspective. Besides our understanding, again, tariffs and immigration were important. You had some deep skepticism about international institutions. Besides that, it wasn't necessarily clear exactly what a first-term Trump would do. We now have a much better sense, and I think his people will have a better sense. So what that could lead to in some ways is actually a little less friction between Trump and his cabinet and other senior leaders in the administration than you saw in Trump's first term.
So we're gonna go deeper into each area, but I wanted to maybe ask Marie, maybe just if you want, maybe focusing on Stefanik, like what do we expect to?
I was going to.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what do we expect a UN with Stefanik having a veto looking like?
Well, first, I deeply believe that the reason she has this job and has risen so fast in the Republican Party is the hearing on anti-Semitism in college campuses. That put her on Trump's radar. I mean, she was on Trump's radar, but that put her in the.
She was on the radar.
She was, but that put her in the forefront of the Republican. Look, I am like knee deep in the right-wing media ecosphere, given my role as a Democratic commentator on Fox. That just rose her stock so much. And it's related because what they want to do at the UN, she is deeply skeptical of the UN. She believes it is anti-Semitic. She believes that the UN is biased against Israel. She believes that UNRWA, the UN agency tasked with providing resources to Palestinians, including Palestinian refugees around the region, is deeply flawed, and she has said should be dismantled. So they are sending she's not quite John Bolton in heels, but she's close. And I think that they are demonstrating that they are going to be very focused on defending Israel. I mean, she's not a one issue pick, but she's close because that is how she gained really the foothold she did in the Republican public consciousness for her role in that hearing and subsequently. I would also very quickly point out that a lot of these are quite young people, Mike Waltz, Elise Stefanik, even Marco Rubio. The Republicans have done a very good job, and maybe
it's like if you made like us cabinet secretaries.
Exactly. I mean, she's 3 years younger than I am, right? So, and there's a question about whether the UN
that'd be a great idea.
Ambassador will even be a cabinet level position in the Trump administration. It was not last time, and it always is in a Democratic administration, at least going back to Madeleine Albright. So they have done a very good job, in some ways better than Democrats, at a new generation of Republican leaders formulating what Republican foreign policy should look like. And it is not George W. Bush's foreign policy, and it is not Mitt Romney's foreign policy, and it's not John McCain's foreign policy. It is Donald Trump's foreign policy. And they're very indicative of that new generation of sort of GOP, I'll use the term thinkers here on foreign policy. I don't agree with much of it, but that's who we're looking at here.
Great. Thank you so much, Marie. So now I want to go to a couple of regions of the world that we often talk about at Perry Worldhouse. Let's start with China. So I'm going to ask Mike, I mean, two big things that we discuss here a lot, but also I think we're hearing Trump's intentions. One would be about tariffs, and the other would be about the cross-strait relations and the Taiwan conflict. So I wondered if you could comment on, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what you expect policy-wise and where you think the world might be going.
I mean, from a geopolitical perspective, there's no more important issue than the People's Republic of China, and no more important region than the Indo-Pacific. The China policy has also been one of the last areas of relative bipartisan consensus in DC, and in some ways, I think you would expect, even though likely they will use different words, and they will explain things a little bit differently, and they will look to point out differences, just as the transition from Trump to Biden did not feature as many policy differences as one might have imagined.
Including on tariffs with China. Right?
Including on tariffs with China. If you look at like export controls on semiconductors and in a bunch of different areas, I think you actually might not see that many differences between U.S. policy toward China especially with regard to cross-strait relations, than you're likely to see, than you saw in a Biden administration. I put like a couple of caveats on that. The first is obviously the focus on tariffs. You didn't have a big shift away from tariffs, obviously, during the Biden administration. In fact, you had leaning in some areas that were viewed as essential to the American economy and American technology leadership. Across the board tariffs on all products from the PRC, as Trump during the campaign said he would do, would be something that would be something potentially different. There's also the point I made previously about the way that Trump, the personalism in some ways that you're likely to see more of in the context of this administration, and the greater uncertainty factor, building on what sort of Marie had said, which means that you always could get some changes, but fundamentally the notion that there is competition between the U.S. and the PRC that spans the economic and military domains, that is centered to some extent, but not completely, on Taiwan. That is unlikely to change, and so is an area that I think might be more of a constant than a variable. But again, we don't know yet who might be the Secretary of Defense. We don't know yet who might be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific, or the Assistant Secretary of State for the Indo-Pacific. And so we as we learn more about some of the people that are nominated to these jobs, we'll have a better sense, at least early on, of what we think policy will look like.
Do you think that this accelerates any timelines? Do you think that the PRC will react to this election and make any changes?
No, I don't think that this would fundamentally change how the PRC, to the extent that what the implied question behind the question is, would this change how the PRC thinks about a potential invasion of Taiwan? There's no indication yet that we've seen that this would fundamentally change that calculation. I think that calculation is going to be made for a lot of reasons. And obviously, the response of the United States is would be a critical part of that decision-making calculus. And deterring the PRC been a top priority of the Biden administration, but I think will be a top priority of the Trump administration as well.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Marie, I'm going to turn to you and to talk about the Middle East. So I think we all know that President-elect Trump and President Netanyahu have a much closer relationship than Biden did. Netanyahu flew to Mar-a-Lago to meet personally with Trump when he was on his official visit. So I'd love to hear your kind of forecast about the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon, and also you mentioned the Abraham Accords, and I know a core interest of yours is Iran. So I know it's a lot, but love the tour, the whole tour here.
Yeah, it's interesting. The last 4 years, when people would ask me, if you could name one thing the Trump administration did that you liked, what would it be? People love asking that question. And I would say the Abraham Accords, because I think talking is better than fighting. And we've seen how particularly the Egyptian and Jordanian peace accords with Israel have been quite durable. But the one thing that the Abraham Accords did not do is they left out the Palestinians. And they took off the table one of the biggest bargaining chips that the Palestinians had, or in theory had, was that Arab states were not normalizing relations with Israel. So I believe, and look, Jared Kushner, who it is unclear whether he will have a role in this administration like he had in the last one, but he has done a ton of work in Saudi Arabia, a ton of financial work in Saudi Arabia since the last Trump administration. They are very focused on trying to finalize the Saudi-Israel deal. The Biden administration has the whole deal finalized essentially right now. Just no one's willing to sign it for a variety of reasons. It's not hard to figure out the contours of it. I think that there's an open question for me about whether Trump's enmity for Iran is real and how deep it is. He is generally transactional, as I said. So on the one hand, I can see him doing a deal with Iran. It's not.
I would say he's the only person that could do it.
Exactly. And it would probably be worse than the nuclear deal we got, but he would say it was so much better, right? I mean, it's what he did when he renegotiated NAFTA, which he basically didn't renegotiate. There were very few differences in the new NAFTA and the old NAFTA, right? So on the one hand, and as someone who worked on the Iran nuclear deal and the Obama administration quite intensely, I can see him actually trying to do a deal. He went to North Korea, he met with Kim Jong-un. But Iran has been a place where it has felt a little more personal, or it's the enmity has come out a little bit more. So I don't know how to predict that one quite yet, but it's one I'm watching. It's one I'm watching because Iran is much closer today to getting a nuclear weapon by light years than they were under the deal, certainly, that Trump withdrew from. He wants the war in Gaza to end. He wants it to end under his administration. You can foresee a similar situation to the Iranian hostages being released the day Reagan is sworn in because Bibi wants to give Trump a win. I don't think they can turn that off that quickly, but I do think that it'll be interesting who he puts as his ambassador to Israel. It'll be interesting who he has running point on this. He had David Friedman in the first term, who was a quite far right, especially on settlement issues. And look, we're talking a lot about Gaza, but I would argue that the peace process is dying in the West Bank more than any place. Settlements have greatly expanded since the last Trump administration. And David Friedman personally has given a lot of money to support those settlements, illegal settlements, most of them. And that is what Bibi has invested a lot of his domestic political effort into. And so I'll be curious who Trump puts in charge of that.
Well, this was actually going to be my follow-up. Do you expect to see essentially just the kind of thing that Professor Lustig has been saying is the reality on the ground? Will that just become the official policy of the United States that they're not settlements? This is Israeli territory.
Yeah, yes, I think so. And I think that I'm so fascinated on the voting tallies out of Dearborn that Trump won, which there's a large Arab American population there, Dearborn, Michigan, that Gretchen Whitmer won 2 years ago, Joe Biden won, because I think the Palestinians in many ways are the biggest losers from this election in a foreign policy context, because I think he does not care at all or believe in Palestinian self-determination. I think that if he thinks anything about it, he thinks about a sort of one state version of but I don't think he has deeply held views on this. But I do believe that he will empower people who essentially let Israel fully annex the West Bank, talk about East Jerusalem. I fully believe that the Palestinians are going to be marginalized even further and deeply in the conversation inside the U.S. government after Donald Trump takes office again. I do not see a path for he will say he has a peace plan, and he had a peace plan he put out last time, but I feel there are a lot of people who didn't vote for Kamala Harris because of the Biden administration's support for Israel and the war in Gaza. And I tried to tell people it will be so much worse under Trump for the Palestinians.
Thanks, Marie. Mike, I want to move to another part of the world. How do you think that the policy towards Ukraine and Russia will play out in the Trump administration?
It's a great question. Marie talked about this in part in her first answer, and that Trump said he could solve this in 24 hours. Like, that might be a little bit aggressive, but obviously he's more willing to talk to Putin and talk to Putin directly. Has a different relationship with Putin than Biden had. And you've already seen, things coming out in the media about the contours of a potential deal, whereby you essentially freeze the line of control between Russia and Ukraine about where it is, which means essentially Ukraine is agreeing to give territory to Russia, or that's a buffer zone, however one ends up sort of dealing with it. And in exchange, Russia agrees to like stop attempting to take the rest of Ukraine. The question is, what else is part of that deal? And that is a potential Ukraine membership in the EU then off the table? Is potential Ukrainian membership in NATO then off the table? Is there something about demilitarization of Ukraine? One could imagine essentially varieties of, if the basic structure is essentially the line of control becomes sort of where the war ends, there's a lot of variation within there that might frankly make it more or less acceptable to Zelensky, like, or Putin, potentially in ways that might influence whether the conflict actually continues. And, and obviously the United States has huge leverage over this, given the amount of support the United States has provided to Ukraine. And we will also then find out if the United States, moves pretty quickly to cut off support for Ukraine, how much Europe's willing to continue to pay up to support the conflict. And frankly, we don't know in some ways what the rest of a Trump-Russia policy would look like, because all of Russia policy during the Biden administration essentially was held hostage to the war after Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine.
I have many more questions, but I am going to, after I ask the next one, open the floor to the audience. And so I'd like you to start thinking about your questions, especially the students in the room. But the last question that I'm going to ask for now is to both of you. I'm really curious about alliances. So NATO is a prominent one, but there are other important alliances around the world. You've both mentioned that President-elect Trump is always quite transactional, quite personalist. What do you think the future of these alliances are, NATO and others? Do you want to start, Marie?
Sure. I mean, if the first administration is prologue, he is quite vocal about his doubt that they give the United States anything, right? That what do we get for this? He doesn't understand. He doesn't believe, I should say, that they're why they are a good, why it's not just charity to South Korea or Japan or NATO or name your alliance country. I do think that I'm quite concerned about NATO. I do think that he is, and I won't get into sort of conspiracy theories on the left about why he feels this way, but he's a Russophile in many ways. And I think that he looks at Putin and he has said that there are things to admire about a strongman type of leader. And I'm not making a partisan statement. He has just said this. He has said this about strongmen leaders around the world. So to Mike's very good point, separate from Ukraine, given Putin's, ferocious hatred of NATO, I do think that will be a compelling argument to Trump. I do think we will probably give less resources to NATO. He has said, there's a quote in one of the recent books that came out. He said, does this really mean I need to go to war over Lithuania? Like, there's no way I would do that. And I believe him when he says that. I think Article 5, is dead for all intents and purposes. And I think in the Mike may disagree with me, that may have been strong, but I think in the Indo-Pacific, I think he thinks we give more than we get in general from alliances, and I'm sure all of our treaty and ally partners today are looking potentially. And it's not just that if we pull back, they're just floating out there, not going to anyone. They will go to someone else, right? Someone will fill that gap. Someone will fill that power vacuum. And in many things, whether it's climate, which you know better than any of us, that someone is often China. When the US pulled back from engaging in Africa, China, in the Caucasus, in Central and Eastern, that is where China fills that gap when American leadership is not there. So.
Love your response, Mike, and I love the disagreement that I saw a little bit,
I
little
felt
glimmer
you,
of.
like,
Yeah.
shaking your head.
Let me start.
Being too dramatic, like hair on fire.
It's like
about
it might be
NATO.
like a little like dead is just like so strong, and like that's a.
Do you think he would enforce it? That he would if Russia goes further, do you think he will?
I think the question is
uphold our obligation.
I think the question is the context in which if like out of nothing Russia invades Lithuania, I think it probably depends a little bit on what the rest of NATO is doing in that context. It's tough for me to imagine Russian tanks rolling through Eastern Europe, and the UK fighting and like UK soldiers fighting and dying and Trump being like, I want to stay out of that. I think
It's not hard at all for me to
I
picture
think
that.
that this will end up, it might end up conditional in some ways on the rest of NATO. Now the question would be if like all of NATO then backs out because they worry that Trump's going to, like you can think about the strategic interactions in some ways in different ways, and like how that plays out. That if everybody in NATO believes what you believe, then thus that decreases their willingness to commit to themselves. Then that probably does make that outcome more likely.
Well, and this is an interest. So I used the term I called Trump an isolationist at an event before the election, and someone said he's not someone corrected that he's not an isolationist. There are places where he wants to get deeply involved. I said earlier, I think he would like take limited military action against cartels in Mexico or the Northern Triangle. And people upstairs were like, "You think he would bomb Mexico?" And I said, "Yes, I think he would use a limited military capability against cartels." So I don't actually think he's totally isolated. But to this point about NATO, I don't think he's a complete isolationist. I think that he is, for whatever reason, predisposed to believe Vladimir Putin, to be more close from a policy perspective to where Russia is than I could ever envision an American president, and quite hesitant to commit American military resources in defense of countries that he does not believe are important.
No argument. Let me shift to the Indo-Pacific for 1 second, though, because I think there's actually or at least I could imagine a difference in some ways based on similar logic to some of his skepticism about NATO countries who aren't spending 2% of their defense budgets the way they're in theory legally obligated to as NATO members. I think Trump has shown some personal skepticism about the relationship with South Korea, and it will be interesting to see whether that continues in this administration. I think that Japan and Australia might be slightly different, and that we've seen a real revolution revolution might be a little bit strong, but like dramatic shift in Japanese defense spending and Japan's willingness to be assertive in the Indo-Pacific as a key part of, remember what I talked about before, the top priority in many ways being the PRC. To the extent that Japan can convince President-elect Trump that, like they're on side essentially in that, and I think they have in some ways a much clearer case to make on that than they did 8 years ago, that in some ways like that, in a country like Australia, which is also investing a lot and has a defense strategy that is very focused, that is focused much more outward now than what previous iterations look like, that would be an interesting test in some ways of Trump's views of alliances, because those are two countries that in theory could be very well positioned to make the case about the way that America's alliances with them directly contribute to America's security in the Indo-Pacific and the world.
Thanks, Mike. I am going to open the floor now. I'm going to give the first question to Trudy, but students, please, we're especially eager to hear from you. So Trudy, the mic is coming to you.
Hi, I tend to agree with Marie on this one. So let me try to frame it and ask what you think. I don't think one can easily separate what's going on in Asia with China from what's going on in Europe with Ukraine. And it seems to me that China will learn critical lessons from what happens with Ukraine. Now, as we all know, in Helsinki in 2018, Trump stood beside Putin and said that that he trusted Putin more than his own intelligence agencies. And we assume that he's going to gut at some level our intelligence agencies. We also know that Trump believes that Ukraine is just a quarrel over territory and doesn't understand Putin's mindset, although he's expressed it in speech after speech, which is that he wants a sphere of influence over much of Europe and Eurasia, and that in addition, he will take the freedom to sabotage, assassinate, buy elections, interfere in ways that don't include military action. So having put all that on the table, Trump believes that if you speak Russian, you belong to Russia. He's made that very clear with Crimea, with the Donbass. He's wrong, totally wrong. Russians have killed more Russian speakers in Ukraine than anyone since Hitler. So, given that belief, why wouldn't he say to Trump, well, Narva in Estonia, well, part of Latvia, they're all Russian speakers. I mean, if Trump believes this man, then there is incredible damage he can do without even arousing the ire of the president. More than that, and this is a question, and then I'll get to the bigger question.
We
So
should just one, Trudy. There's a lot of questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Pick
Just
one.
let me say one
Just
thing.
pick one question.
Zelensky has said that any peace talks have to be based on Article 2 of the UN Charter. You don't invade another country and annex. I think the UN is dead. It's dead now, except for the specialized agencies, but officially dead. If that is accepted, you can invade and annex. So my bigger question is, can you separate what happens in Ukraine from what happens with Taiwan and in Asia? Because who would trust Trump, who has already indicated doubts about coming to Taiwan's aid and has said that he's so close to Xi Jinping that Xi would give in to him or else 150% tariffs or else Xi knows I'm frigging crazy, which is what Trump told the Wall Street Journal. Can you separate those two? And is the UN dead if Ukraine is handed over on a plate?
Thanks, Trudy.
Sure. I think there are sort of two pieces here. I mean, it's a great question. I think the first is certainly a Russia-Ukraine settlement deal pushed by the United States that is seen probably correctly in the worst case in some ways that you're describing would be, I think, would certainly undermine American credibility around the world in some ways. Now, obviously, if a NATO partner is invaded and the United States does nothing, that would be devastating to U.S. credibility, around the world. There'd be I think a challenge then in sort of making the case in the Indo-Pacific. I think if you were going to make that argument, the argument you would probably make in some ways builds on kind of what Marie said about the unique relationship between Trump and Putin, and that he doesn't have that relationship with Xi, and he's unlikely to have that relationship with Xi. So you're unlikely to see sort of Trump adopting Xi's perspective on the world. Now, but the impact on U.S. credibility if a NATO country was conquered would be unbelievable and extremely negative.
And I'll pick up before we get on the next question. I think part of what is so compelling in what you said, Trudy, is, of course, if a NATO country is conquered, but remember how we got here. I'm happy to be an equal opportunity critic. You know, Putin moved into Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine during the Obama administration.
Putin didn't invade during the Trump administration because he was already there.
Because he was already there. And there are a lot of people who believe that the administration I served in for 8 years was not strong enough, was not tough enough, gave, sort of winked and nodded and said, just keep that. It's okay. I mean, we never said that. Barack Obama gave his exit interview to Jeff Goldberg about the Obama foreign policy doctrine. And there's a line in there people forget that he says, I'm not going to go to war with Russia over Crimea, right? That's not in our national security interest. So in some ways, what I'm more worried about isn't taking over an entire NATO country. It's you named a couple of places that Russia has focused. Now that there are 2 new NATO members that are quite close to Russia, there's more opportunities for that to pick off islands, territories, little parts, and it's just creeps. And this Russia is a hard problem. I mean, Barack Obama wasn't entirely wrong that at the time there would have been very little appetite for large-scale military support to Ukraine because of Crimea. Now, should and could we have done more? Lots of people have said we should and could have. That's a good issue to debate. But I think this is what worries me more, is that Putin just it's like you keep eating little slices of pie, and then eventually you wake up and you see there's no pie left. The Arctic, exactly, the Arctic.
So our next
Great.
question,
of like a
in
new
the- in
status
the- in
quo.
the middle of the front row here.
So I wanted to ask, in the past administration of Biden's administration, like the relation between America and Mexico has become like really damaged, and we have seen like fights with the previous president. Now President Sheinbaum has got into fights with the American ambassador in Mexico City. So like, do you think that Trump will be able to pull off like a better relationship with Mexico than the Biden administration, or like worsen it up? And of course, like with the new NAFTA agreement, like how do you think that would play off?
Thanks so much.
So I'll start if that's okay. I think there's a real potential that if he undertakes mass deportations, they have to go somewhere. I think a bunch of them will go to Mexico. And I think if he really does this, and depending on how he does it, there's a real chance that he poisons relationships with these countries because he's just sending people back. It's become a huge political liability there. I do not think it's outside the realm of possibility that he uses the United States military or special forces I'm not saying he's going to bomb Mexico, but I do think that, to Mike's first point, he cares about immigration more than anything. And he's not talking about the wall anymore, right? I mean, he does sometimes in his 90-minute speeches, but he's really focused on mass deportation.
Cover a lot.
You cover a lot, yeah. But I do think that I can foresee a scenario in which he uses U.S. force of some kind in Mexico or in the Northern Triangle or elsewhere to go after cartels or fentanyl, right? Something that is core to his. So I'm deeply concerned about that relationship for that reason. I
Mike-
hope I'm wrong.
Mike, did you want to jump in? And then
No,
we'll
take another question.
Professor O'Leary.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. Two questions from two different parts of the world. Would you advise the Kurds of Syria to surrender to the Ba'ath regime? And secondly, what advice would you give to the new government in London?
I mean, I'm not sure I would ever tell the Kurds to surrender because they certainly won't. And that seems like a constant in some ways over many generations sort of in the region. So regardless of what one thinks, I think the Kurds in Syria are likely to continue fighting and probably also to prove more resilient than one might imagine. I mean, I view Turkish pressure as a constant in some ways, rather than a variable. And frankly, you know the like micro details of this like better than I do. But I don't view that dynamic as likely to fundamentally change, or at least if it does, that's probably going to be a good example of where where the preferences of people appointed by Trump matter a lot, since that is not an area that Trump, like a specific part of the Middle East that Trump seems like is likely to personally focus on unless forced by some kind of attack on U.S. troops or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there are a lot of questions for the new government in London, which has had its own set of challenges since coming into AUKUS. The near and dear to my heart is the AUKUS Accord between the U.S., Australia, and the UK. And I think my suspicion is that the UK will look for some opportunities, like perhaps investments in AUKUS-related capabilities, to demonstrate that it has and will have under the Trump administration a close partnership. Obviously with the rise of the Labour Party in the UK, that generates some political dynamics that are slightly different for interacting with the Trump administration than last time around. But look, the UK also has like the largest and savviest operation in DC possible, in some ways, and also we all love the UK. And so I've no
that Professor O'Leary loves the UK.
I know he has a good poker face, but I have no doubt. Essentially, I have no doubt that the UK has been planning for this and has an approach that they think will be successful, and probably thinks that they can ride out some however Trump's skepticism about other countries impacts U.S. foreign policy.
I'll say one very, very brief thing. I also think that the Western Alliance will be looking for a new leader. I mean, if we're talking about Ukraine, if we really do cut off aid, and I don't know that it's the UK or the new government there, but I think that if this is Europe defending Europe without the level of support they've become accustomed to, somebody needs to step up and rally the troops and figure out what they're going to do. I don't know that that's the UK. I just think that
Well, can I actually?
You wanted to make a
can I-
big move. If you were the UK and you wanted to make a big move.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up because I mean, the German government's collapsing, so it won't be them, at least for now. The French government talks this way, but do they have the capability to be that leader, do you think? I mean, seriously, I just wonder who will it be?
That is
So-
that is an open.
Okay. All right, sir. We're gonna, well,
In addition to aiding and abetting genocide in Gaza, our nation has killed, in my lifetime, 20 million of the world's people, 10 million directly, 10 million by proxy, mostly in Southeast Asia and the Middle East and Latin America. My question is, and we've also overthrown democratically and assassinated democratically elected leaders. Are we still doing that? And even if we're not, hasn't what we've done affecting current and future events? And why aren't we talking about that? And who has been held accountable for all this killing?
thanks.
So I'll start. What you said, I think that sentiment is one of the main arguments that Donald Trump made and that got the Trump foreign policy as we see it today. I mean, the comments he made recently about Liz Cheney and her father and the war in Iraq. I mean, he has so fundamentally shifted Republican foreign policy away from Ronald Reagan and certainly from George W. Bush, who, you know, an administration filled with neocons who never saw a foreign conflict they didn't want to get involved in. I mean, to your point. And the fact that not that many years later, Donald Trump is the standard bearer, standing on stage saying, we've gone overseas and we're not going to do that anymore. I'm not saying it's for a moral reason, just to be very clear. But I think it resonated with a lot of people. And we saw this in voter data that particularly young men and women, they were getting targeted ads saying, if Joe Biden wins again, you're going to have to go back overseas and fight in Ukraine or fight in Gaza. I mean, none of that was true, but I think that I don't want
No,
to, I don't want to define it for you, but sort of an anti-war sentiment coming out of decades, 25 years since 9/11 of continuous war. I think that was a very powerful motivating force for lots of people who don't like a lot of things about Donald Trump, but he was saying, we're not going to do that anymore. Right. And so just from a narrative perspective, I think that was a quite powerful driver in this election. And that's why, I mean, the fact that Dick Cheney endorsed Kamala Harris and not the Republic, like my 2004 mind cannot wrap its head around that. Right.
Yeah, like I would say, like Trump captured the zeitgeist of what used to be the liberal critique of American foreign policy.
Which you just made, right?
In a way that is sort of unprecedented. It means, because you started talking, my initial response is to be like, those are really great points. And yet America is the greatest force for good the world has ever seen. And both of these things can be true simultaneously. But you just saw Trump campaign in a very different way.
Thanks. Now we see lots of students putting their hands up. So I'm going to ask you next.
Oh, okay. China and Russia are often presented as like the two global superpowers competing against the United States. And so keeping that in mind, I'm always a little confused as to why Trump is so admirative of Putin and so okay with like letting the sphere of influence for Russia expand while so against China's sphere of influence expanding, especially like his trade policy. Why is there such a different notion towards these two superpowers between Russia and China?
I think it's a great question. And I think Trump's, to Marie's point about Trump kind of being a Russophile, in a way and trusting Putin about a lot of things, I think in some ways sort of gets to the explanation a bit. I think one of the interesting things, though, we've seen the last couple of years is the way this axis of upheaval, or whatever you want to call it, has really come together between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran in the context of supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine. And in some ways that like mixes up in a blender a bunch of things that President-elect Trump has some different views about. And I think it'll be interesting to see sort of how that plays out in this context, whether it's Iran's factories producing the weapons that Russia is using in Ukraine, whether that is, what we know about China's support for Russia. But it does seem like Trump views Russia and China at this point very differently, outside of the context that he admires strength. And in some ways admires strength regardless of the political regime that we're talking about, but does seem to have unique preferences in some ways when it comes to Russia.
I think, look, there's been a million words written about Trump and Russia. I think that part of the explanation is there is a conservative, sometimes religious, but cultural, that Putin is promoting. It's very nationalist. It's very racial in some ways. It's very religious. And I think that Trump sees, there's more cultural similarities I think he sees with Putin than certainly he does with the Chinese.
Thanks so much. There's a woman in the white top in the second row here. Thanks. I'm sorry, I don't know all of your names yet.
How dare you not know every student's name that comes here?
I know,
Michael?
seriously.
I have two questions. So
What is your name, just so we know it next time?
yes, my name is Roxana.
Hey.
Hi, nice to meet you guys. So my first question is, obviously we talked a lot about Trump's interests being motivated by like his own personal interests. I know that there's been some talk I saw in the New York Times about, because Tiffany Trump's husband is like Lebanese, there's some hope that that will sway him because he is so personally motivated. And then the second question I had is, just because Trumpism is so new, and I don't know if it's quite yet like a full-blown policy approach, do you think that there's going to be any differences should, Trump, given his age, move on and it becomes JD Vance? Do you see any differences between those two, as, lots of talk about Trump's age? Thank you.
Start, Marie.
Yeah, I mean, JD Vance hasn't been in the political scene for that long, so I think his views are still being formulated. But what I do know about him, and I'm from the state of Ohio, so he's from my home state, is he is very online. And he was one of the people push
Taylor Lorenz kind of way, like.
yeah, very good reference. Yeah, I mean, he was one of the people pushing Trump not to select Mike Pompeo for a job because he thinks Pompeo's too much of a neocon, too much of a globalist, right? JD Vance is very, in this online right-wing world of the people posting memes saying Zelensky's allowance is about
He's
to
made a
cut out.
bet.
Like he's very, yes, that is, but his views are not fully formed on foreign policy. I think you would probably agree. What was your first question? Oh, on his son-in-law. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think he has lots of personal reasons to feel things about the Middle East. He has his family and he have a ton of financial dealings in the Gulf. Jared Kushner in billions of dollars in Saudi Arabia since the last administration. They have quite close personal relationships in Israel with the Netanyahu family and others on the right, on the far right particularly. So I think he has a lot of personal ties to a lot of these countries. I think he wants to show that he was the one who was able to bring stability. The big question is what he's going to do vis-a-vis Iran. I mean, I mentioned it a little earlier. I think there are military options that are quite he likes, that are quite good looking to him in some ways. But they're not great actually strategically. So I will be very, 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 very curious what he does with Iran. The Biden administration has not negotiated with them directly, unlike the Obama administration. I can see him walking in and saying, I'm going to talk to them, right? But, the Lebanese son-in-law, who knows?
It's not like if you have an administration and a president that that is in an administration that might be a little more personalistic, and where you have a shot at directly influencing, getting to the president, influencing the president directly, take the shot, right? I mean, I'm not surprised to see articles like that, because absolutely you would take the shot to try to influence the president-elect directly.
Can I just as a follow-up though on what you just said, Marie, can you just lay out for us kind of you've both made oblique references to Iran, like What are some of the Iran? Yeah, what are the, what are 3 or 4 possible futures? Like, what are the options actually?
So I think one option is re-engaging in direct diplomatic negotiations over the nuclear program, the missile program, that's support for regional proxies. I don't think Trump will negotiate over human rights. I don't think he necessarily those are his priorities. But there is a universe where he says we're going to negotiate over these things, and I'm going to do a deal. He's the art of the deal, right? I think there's a scenario where the maximum pressure.
You need to escalate a little bit more to get like I'm thinking about the North Korea example and how it's you have North Korea escalate and then Trump's like I'm the guy that can do the deal.
Well, right. So there's the maximum. The question is, do they put the maximum pressure, the campaign they put on Iran the first time, which was basically increased sanctions, right? But sanctions, the reason Iran came to the negotiating table in the Obama term over the nuclear deal was because of the quite crippling sanctions we had put on their oil and financial sectors. So they may I think they will definitely ramp up sanctions on whatever is left in Iran to sanction. I think that is without a doubt they will do on day one, probably. The question is what comes next. Look, there are military options. Iran is probably under 2 weeks away from having enough highly enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon if they decided to do so. We don't know that they've decided to do so, but they're really close. As a reminder, under the nuclear deal, they were more than a year away. So if Trump is given intel from his intelligence communities, which I do think he will much more personalize. I spent the first 6 years of my career as a CIA analyst working on the Middle East. I think he will, and we prided this was after Iraq WMD. We prided ourselves on giving the analysis no matter what. I think the intelligence agencies Intel and DOJ are going to come under the most intense political pressure to put spin on the ball when they normally don't. I can see him getting an intel report that says Iran is building a nuclear weapon. Then you have a decision to make. You can bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. There are many of them. Some of them are deeply underground. We are the only country in the world that has a bomb that can reach them. Trump used it once in Afghanistan. We have more of them. That sets off a whole cascading set of things. I can give you all the reasons why even bombing the nuclear facilities would not destroy the nuclear program like it did in Syria or Iraq. But you could, and then some people have suggested striking Iran's oil facilities to take funding away from their ability to fund the Houthi and Hezbollah and Hamas. What I think is more likely is increased strikes on the Houthi in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, Iranian proxies operating in the region. I think they want the Red Sea open. They want trade back. I think what's most likely is increased military action against Iranian proxies and not Iran proper, absent some great escalation from Iran or some rush to break out to build a weapon. Sorry, that was a long Iran answer. But
No, that's great. Thanks so much. We have time for one more question. I am going to ask one more student. Go ahead. I'm assuming you're a student. Okay.
Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. The Biden administration recently released its National Security Memorandum on Artificial Intelligence. Did
Mike tell you to ask this question? No, go on.
Do you foresee the incoming administration making any significant changes to the content or implementation of this strategy as we try to keep pace with our adversaries, particularly the PRC in this area?
It's a good question. I mean, if you look at the Republican platform, the argument that many made was that the Biden approach was too regulatory. And so there have been promises to repeal the Biden executive order, and which would probably involve repealing the National Security Memorandum, although whether those things happen at the same time is a different question. And thus, in theory, like taking the shackles off. In some ways, I'm moving forward with AI. I mean, look, my personal feeling is that the U.S. has always been more at risk of moving too slowly rather than too quickly on this.
Innovate, not to regulate.
On innovation but did not view what the Biden administration was doing as sort of hampering that. I think the U.S. has been very conservative for other reasons. I think the presence of Musk in the sort of Trump's decision-making circles is certainly a wild card here, and that on the one hand, Musk and a lot of the folks that Musk is like spending a lot of time with in Silicon Valley are part of the sort of like accelerationist, like camp on AI, arguing that we need to go faster. Industry's going pretty fast, just to be clear. On the other hand, Musk also supported what was a relatively controversial piece of legislation in California that promoted AI safety and involved a bunch of regulation. In regulation that really split in some ways the AI community in Silicon Valley. And so if to the extent that Musk in some ways is a proxy for what we're likely to see in the Trump years, it sort of gives like mixed signals. And Trump's old chief technology officer is now one of the two leaders of the Trump technology, of the technology policy transition. And while, again, I mean, you have this sort of rhetoric about sort of opposing regulation and like federal restrictions on AI. On the other hand, the Trump administration actually published the first ever executive order on artificial intelligence, which then the Biden administration sort of built on. And some of those same folks look to be involved in the Trump administration. So less regulation, more acceleration, but details really unclear.
Well, thank you all. I know there were a lot of questions we didn't get to both online and in the room, but I think it's really clear that this is a topic that will continue to occupy us here. I also want to thank all of you for being here. I think you can know that you can count on us and the events that we put on for really serious analysis of foreign policy in general, but as we move into this new administration. So I want to thank my colleagues, Mike and Marie, for this really great hour. Thank all of you. Let's thank them. And I'd also like to thank the audience for spending your afternoon with us, and we will see you in our next event.